My uncle came back from overseas after 15 years and saw me covered in bruises, tearfully confessed that my husband had done this to me. He gave a slight smile and said, "Go to a hotel and rest. Tomorrow we play his game, but by my rules." The arrivals board at Charlotte Douglas flickered from on time to landed at 6:42 in the evening, and I felt my stomach drop the way it used to when I was small and waiting for a school bus that was already 10 minutes late. 15 years is a strange unit of time to hold in your chest while you stand at a railing watching strangers stream through frosted glass doors with their carry-ons and their exhausted children. 15 years ago, I had been 12. I had worn a purple windbreaker to the same airport and cried into it because my favorite person in the world was getting on a plane to go build turbine rigs somewhere I couldn't pronounce, and he had knelt down to my height and told me that 15 years sounded like forever. But it wasn't, not really, and that he'd be back before I knew it. He had been wrong about the before I knew it part. I had gotten a full childhood's worth of knowing it in between. My mother stood beside me twisting the strap of her purse the way she always did when she was nervous, and I realized with a small jolt that she was more nervous than I was, which said something, because I had spent the entire drive to the airport gripping the wheel with both hands like it might try to escape me. Ray was her baby brother, 14 years between them, which had made him more like an older cousin to me than an uncle, someone who still remembered what it was like to be a kid because he hadn't been that far removed from being one himself when I was born. He'd taught me to ride a bike in a parking lot on a Sunday when the store was closed, running alongside me with one hand hovering an inch from the seat, not touching, just ready. He'd taught me to swim in the French Broad River, the cold shock of it, his hands under my belly holding me up until I stopped panicking and started floating. He fixed every bike on our block for free and never once made anyone feel like they owed him for it. When I was 10, my father forgot my birthday for the second year running, and Ray showed up unannounced with a cake he'd clearly bought at the last gas station he passed and a card that just said, "Sorry, your old man's an idiot. Love, Uncle Weston." Everyone called him Ray. I don't actually know why. Some childhood mispronunciation of Raymond that stuck to everyone except official paperwork. He never once broke a promise to me. Not one in 12 years, which is an unusually clean record for anyone, let alone an adult a kid is relying on. So when he left for the rig job at what would have been my 13th birthday, and the promise was I'll call every week, I believed him with the same total faith I believed the sun would rise. The first year, he did call every week. Static crackled international calls where I could hear machinery in the background, and he'd shout over it about the terrible food and the guy on his crew who'd brought a ukulele. The second year, it dropped to twice a month. By the fourth year, we were down to birthday calls and the occasional postcard with a stamp from a country I had to look up on a map. His handwriting getting worse with every passing year, like the good pen ran out somewhere over the ocean and he'd been signing things with a dull pencil stub ever since. I didn't blame him. I want to be clear about that because when I tell people this story now, they sometimes want to make it a story about abandonment, and it wasn't. Not really. Rigs eat your whole life. He was gone 11 months at a stretch sometimes, in places where a phone call cost more than a week's groceries and the internet, if it existed at all, moved like it was being pushed uphill. He sent money instead. Steady, unglamorous, dependable money, first for my school trips, then for my college textbooks, then the year I got married, an envelope with more cash in it than I made in 2 months at the time, and a note that said, "Wish I could be there, kid." Give him hell. He hadn't been there. Nobody had properly vetted Derek, and it still catches in my throat sometimes, using his actual name instead of the placeholder I used for the first year after everything. My mother met him exactly once, at an engagement dinner, and pulled me aside in the parking lot afterward to say he felt too smooth, like a stone polished so long you can't tell what's underneath. I laughed it off. I was 26 and in love with the idea of being chosen by someone who seemed, on paper, assembled with tweezers and a level. Ray hadn't been consulted at all. Ray had been somewhere off the coast of West Africa the entire courtship, engagement, and wedding, sending his congratulations through spotty satellite calls, promising he'd finally meet the guy properly once he made it stateside for good, half joking that he'd need to run a background check before he handed over his blessing. Haha, don't worry, just kidding mostly. Now here he was, walking through the frosted doors in a wrinkled button-down that had clearly been slept in on a transatlantic flight, a duffel bag over one shoulder that looked older than I was, gray threading through hair that used to be the same dark brown as mine, and the same crooked lopsided smile that had shown up in every memory I had of him since before I could form memories properly. He spotted my mother first and broke into something close to a jog, and she was crying before he reached her, and I stood there watching two people who had grown up sharing a bedroom in a two-bedroom house hug each other like they were making up for every missed Christmas at once. Then he turned to me. "There she is," he said, and his voice cracked slightly on the word she, and he dropped the duffel bag right there on the airport floor and pulled me in. I hugged him back. I meant to hug him back the way you're supposed to hug someone you've missed for 15 years. All in, no holding back, and some part of me did mean it that way, but another part of my body had learned over the last 2 years to flinch first and ask permission of itself second. It was involuntary. It was the kind of thing you don't decide to do. Your shoulders just do it. Your spine just does it. A half-inch contraction that happens before your conscious mind even registers contact. I felt it happen. I felt my own body betray 2 years of very careful management in about a quarter of a second, and I felt Ray feel it too, because his arms, which had been in the middle of a full, enthusiastic, missed you so much squeeze, paused, not for long, maybe a second and a half. But Ray had spent 2 decades reading pressure gauges and hairline stress fractures in metal that was about to fail catastrophically, reading the difference between a normal vibration and one that meant get everyone off this platform right now, and a flinch in his niece's shoulders when he he hugged her. Hello was not a subtlety that was going to get past him. He pulled back, not all the way, just far enough to look at me properly, his hands still resting on my upper arms, and I watched his eyes do a very quick, very practiced sweep. Too thin. He clocked that first, I think, the way my collarbones showed more than they used to, the way my wrists looked when he was holding my arms. Then his eyes moved up to my face, which I had over-prepared for this reunion. Foundation a shade heavier than I usually wore it, and I saw something flicker there, a kind of assessment I didn't have a name for yet. You look tired, kiddo, he said. Light, easy. The exact tone he'd have used when I was 9 and up too late reading with a flashlight under the covers. Long week, I said. Everybody's exhausted. It's been a long week for everyone. Which wasn't even a lie, technically. It just wasn't the truth either. And I've since learned that's the exact shape most of what I said for 2 years took. Not fabrication. Omission wearing fabrication's coat. We drove to my parents' house that night, all 3 of us in my mother's car. Ray in the back seat like a kid himself, talking a mile a minute about the flight, the layover in Amsterdam, a guy on the plane who'd tried to bring a live parakeet on board in his jacket pocket. He was performing normalcy for my mother's benefit, I think, giving her the homecoming she'd pictured for 15 years, and I was grateful for it because it meant I didn't have to talk much. I sat in the passenger seat and watched the strip malls go by and thought about the long-sleeve cardigan folded in my bag at home, the one I wore in 90-degree heat, and wondered if Ray had noticed that too. Waiting there at baggage claim, cardigan over a sundress in July. He had noticed. I found that out the next morning. My mother had planned a whole day, lunch at her house, and everyone driving back to my parents' place for dinner. A whole reunion itinerary assembled with the precision of someone who'd been waiting a decade and a half to execute it. But Ray asked over breakfast if he could steal me for an hour first. Just the 2 of us. Coffee. My mother, who I think understood exactly what was happening even if she couldn't have named it, said of course, take your time, and didn't ask a single follow-up question, which from my mother was itself a small act of love. We ended up at a diner 2 exits from the airport because Ray said he wanted pancakes that didn't come wrapped in plastic, and because, I understood later, he wanted somewhere with a parking lot and privacy and enough ambient diner noise that nobody at the next booth would overhear whatever was about to happen. We sat across from each other in a red vinyl booth with a jukebox selector bolted to the wall between us, and he ordered coffee for both of us without asking, which under different circumstances might have irritated me, given everything. But from Ray, it just felt like being 12 again, someone else handling the small decisions so I didn't have to. He didn't say anything for a while. He stirred sugar into coffee he usually took black, which I noticed and didn't mention, a small tell that his hands needed something to do. Then he set the spoon down very deliberately on the napkin and looked at me the way he used to look at a bike chain that had come off wrong, trying to see the whole mechanism before touching anything. How long has he been hitting you? He said. Not have you been hitting yourself. Not is everything okay at home. Not the dozen softer, more deniable versions of the question that a person could ask and still leave you room to lie your way out cleanly. He asked it the way you'd ask someone what year the accident happened, like the fact of it was already settled in his mind, and the only open variable was the timeline. I opened my mouth to say the thing I'd said to the 2 other people who'd ever come close to asking, which was some version of it's not like that, or he's just stressed, or you don't understand him like I do, and none of it came out. I don't know if it was the specificity of the question or the fact that it was Ray asking it. Ray who'd never once in 12 years given me a reason to lie to him, but something in my chest that had been welded shut for 2 years came apart all at once, and I put my face in my hands and started crying in the middle of a diner at 8 in the morning, loud enough that the waitress refilling coffee 2 booths over paused mid-pour. Ray didn't reach across the table. He didn't do the thing people do where they pat your hand while you cry, which always somehow makes it worse, makes you perform the crying instead of just doing it. He just sat there, present, solid, waiting, the same way he used to wait at the edge of the river while I worked up the nerve to put my face in the water. 2 years, I finally managed. It's been about 2 years. He nodded once, slow, like a man confirming a measurement he'd already estimated correctly. Tell me, he said. All of it. Start wherever you want. So I told him, not all of it in order, because trauma doesn't come out in order. It comes out in the sequence your nervous system decides is safe to release. But I told him the shape of it, and he sat there with his hands wrapped around a coffee mug he wasn't drinking from and let me. I told him about the office mixer where I'd met Derek 3 years after Ray left for the last long contract, a downtown networking event I'd only gone to because a coworker dragged me, and I'd been planning to leave after 1 drink. Derek had been the kind of confident that reads at first glance as competence rather than performance. He remembered my name after being introduced exactly once. He asked follow-up questions about my job that suggested he'd actually listened to the answer to the first question. He was, by every metric I had at 26, exactly what I thought I was supposed to want. My mother met him at an engagement dinner 8 months later and told me in the parking lot afterward that he felt too smooth, a compliment that curdled the moment you looked at it twice. I laughed it off. I married him within the year. In a ceremony Ray watched over a satellite call from a rig somewhere off Ghana, his voice cutting in and out as he told me he wished he could walk me down the aisle himself. The first 2 years were good. I want to say that clearly, because it's the part people skip when they hear stories like this, and it's the part that makes the rest of it make sense. He was attentive. He remembered anniversaries down to the exact restaurant of our first date. He cried actual tears at our wedding, which had disarmed every skeptical relative in the room, including eventually me. The cruelty crept in slowly enough that I built a whole architecture of excuses to house it before I ever had to look at it directly. A snapped comment at a waiter, a joke at a dinner party about my little job. My friends disappeared one by one, each departure framed as a reasonable, even loving act of curation, until my entire social world had contracted down to just my parents and him. I told myself a controlling husband was a kind of normal I simply hadn't experienced before, some married people thing nobody had warned me about, even though the person I'd been at 22 had once stood up in the middle of a lecture hall to correct a professor who was factually wrong and had refused flatly to sign off on a report her own manager had doctored 2 jobs earlier. A strong woman doesn't hand over her whole self in a single transaction. She gets worn down in installments, each one small enough to survive, until survival itself starts to look, from the inside, indistinguishable from love. The first time Derek hit me was after a holiday party, 18 months into the marriage. He'd accused me, in the car on the way home, of flirting with a coworker who had, in reality, spent the entire conversation asking me about a spreadsheet macro I'd built for our team. I'd laughed, genuinely, at something the coworker said, a normal laugh at a normal joke, and Derek had gone quiet in a way I hadn't yet learned to read as dangerous. In our kitchen, 20 minutes later, he slapped me hard enough that I hit the edge of the cabinet and split my lip. Then, and this is the part that took me the longest to understand, he dropped to his knees on our kitchen floor and sobbed actual body-racking sobs, telling me he didn't recognize himself, that he'd never do it again, that his own father used to do the same thing to his mother, and he'd sworn his whole life he'd never become that man. And here he was, becoming that man, and he was so sorry. So sorry, so sorry. I forgave him. I held his head against my chest on our kitchen floor and told him it was okay, and some sick, exhausted part of me even felt sorry for him, for whatever wound in his own childhood had apparently reached forward through time to make his hand move like that. For 3 months after that, he was perfect. Flowers for no occasion. A trip to the coast I hadn't asked for. Notes left on the bathroom mirror. Then it happened again, over something even smaller than the first time. A comment I'd made about wanting to visit my college roommate that he decided, somehow, constituted disrespect, and the cycle repeated itself, except the calm period after was shorter, 2.5 months instead of 3, then 2, then 6 weeks. The excuses I made for the marks became rehearsed, almost scripted, a stock phrase for every part of my body. I bruise easily. I bumped into the door frame. I'm just clumsy lately. Work has me so stressed I haven't been sleeping and I keep walking into things. In public, Derek remained the same charming, attentive husband everyone had always envied, complimenting me in front of friends, opening every door, remembering every anniversary, which made the whole thing feel almost impossible to say out loud even to myself, because who would believe that the man doing all of that was also the man who'd left a bruise the shape of a cabinet corner on my ribs 3 days earlier. By the 5th year, I had become fluent in the sound of his footsteps in the hallway, able to tell from the cadence alone whether it would be a calm night. I wasn't a woman who had given up. I was running a very quiet background process, researching divorce law at 2 in the morning with the brightness turned down, hiding $20 bills in an old coffee tin in the pantry. What kept that process running slower than it should have was fear in 2 shapes. Financial, because Derek had engineered me into a lower-paying job so we could spend time together, and social, the certainty that no one would take my word over his easy, practiced charm. I told Ray all of this in a diner booth 2 exits from the airport, in no particular order, some of it through tears and some of it in a flat reporting voice I didn't recognize as my own, and he sat there and absorbed every piece of it without interrupting once, his jaw working slightly, a muscle in his cheek flexing and releasing like a valve under more pressure than it was built to hold. Go to a hotel tonight, he said, once I'd finally run out of words. Get some rest. Tomorrow, we play his game, but by my rules. I didn't ask what that meant. There was something in the way he said it, flat and certain, that told me asking would only slow him down, and some tired, battered part of me had decided, somewhere over the last 20 minutes of talking, to simply hand the wheel to someone else for the first time in 2 years. I checked into a Marriott off the interstate that afternoon under my maiden name, which felt like a small, private act of defiance even though nobody was chasing me yet, and I lay on top of the comforter without changing out of my clothes and stared at a ceiling for 6 hours, running through every possible version of tomorrow. Most of the versions ended badly. I pictured Ray showing up at our door and throwing a punch, ending up arrested, ending up worse than that, because I had spent 2 years learning exactly how volatile Derek became when he felt cornered, and I couldn't picture Ray, however solid, however calm, walking away from that unscathed. What actually happened started, unglamorously, with Ray asking to stay with me and Derek for a few days. He framed it to Derek as jet lag and a desire to get to know his new nephew-in-law properly before flying north to see the rest of the family. And Derek, who performed hospitality the way other people perform breathing, agreed immediately, pulled out the good scotch, gave Ray the full tour of the condo, narrated the square footage and the view and the building's amenities like a man reciting a resume. I sat on the edge of our sectional that first night and watched Derek work the room, refilling Ray's glass before it was empty, asking Ray detailed, admiring questions about rig life, laughing at exactly the right moments, and I understood, watching it, that I was seeing the same performance that had once convinced me, except now I had an audience member who wasn't buying it. Ray noticed things over those first few days that I had stopped consciously registering because I'd been living inside them too long to see their outline anymore. He noticed that I kept my sleeves pulled down even in the condo's overheated living room in July. He noticed that Derek answered questions about our finances with a specificity that felt rehearsed, mentioning, unprompted, that the condo's title was entirely clean, no liens, no shared claims, a detail nobody had asked him for. He noticed that Derek's phone, which sat face down on the kitchen counter during dinner the first night, had started disappearing into his pocket by by the second night, and that Derek had begun stepping out onto the narrow balcony to take calls at odd hours, his voice dropping into a register I'd learned over 2 years to associate with trouble, even though I'd never once been given access to what that trouble actually was. On the third night, Derek stepped out to take one of those calls, and Ray, without a word, walked over to where I was standing at the kitchen counter and looked deliberately at a stack of mail I'd left there, bank statements, and a couple of unopened envelopes I hadn't gotten around to. He didn't touch anything. He just looked, the same unhurried, comprehensive look he used to give an engine before deciding whether to trust it, and I watched his eyes catch on something. A return address, a logo I recognized vaguely as belonging to a private lending company, the kind that advertises on late-night television with a jingle and a phone number that spells out a word. Derek came back inside a few minutes later, phone already vanishing into his pocket, and asked too brightly if anyone wanted more wine. The next morning, while Derek was in the shower, Ray asked me quietly if I knew anything about a company called Meridian Bridge Capital. I said I didn't. I genuinely didn't at that point. 2 years of a marriage narrowing down to a handful of controlled topics meant our finances had become, functionally, a closed room I wasn't given a key to. Another small, reasonable-sounding arrangement Derek had engineered under the banner of not wanting you to have to worry about the boring stuff. Ray didn't push it further that morning. He just filed it away, the same way he used to file away a strange vibration in machinery days before it actually failed. Patient, methodical, waiting for the next data point to arrive on its own. It arrived 2 nights later, and it arrived badly. Derek came home from work in a mood I recognized instantly, the particular quality of silence he carried when something at the office had gone wrong and he needed somewhere private to put the pressure. He picked a fight over the brand of coffee I'd bought, an argument so disproportionate to its supposed subject that Ray, sitting at the dinner table, went very still, the same stillness he'd shown at the diner, and I saw him understand in real time exactly how these evenings escalated. Derek shoved me hard into the corner of the kitchen island while Ray was in the next room, quick enough and quiet enough that by the time Ray came around the corner, it had already happened, and I was gripping the counter with a fresh, spreading bruise blooming under my ribs where the granite edge had caught me. Ray didn't say a word to Derek that night. He looked at Derek for exactly 3 seconds, a look I've never seen replicated on another person's face before or since, and then he asked me if I was all right, in a voice pitched carefully neutral, and helped me to a chair. It was that night, after Derek had gone to bed, that Ray found the rest of it. He'd gone looking, he told me later, not through anything locked or hidden, just through the ordinary chaos of a kitchen junk drawer while getting ice for my ribs, the kind of drawer every household has, and beneath a tangle of takeout menus and dead batteries, he found a folded stack of paper that Derek had apparently stuffed there in a hurry, rather than properly filed away. A loan document from Meridian Bridge Capital, the same name Ray had clocked on the mail 2 nights earlier, outlining a delinquent balance in the low 6 figures. And beneath that, a single handwritten IOU, on a torn half sheet of notebook paper, made out to a name Ray recognized immediately from his years working adjacent to industries that occasionally required knowing which names to avoid. Elias Caldwell, a private lender operating well outside any regulated banking structure, the kind of debt that doesn't get sent to collections because it doesn't officially exist. Derek was drowning, it appeared, in gambling debt. It made a certain kind of sense laid out that way. The volatility, the controlling behavior, an attempt, maybe, to manage the one part of his life he still felt he had power over, while the rest of it came apart in a casino or on some app on his phone. The isolation he'd engineered around me, maybe partly so I wouldn't notice how thin our finances had actually gotten underneath the surface of a nice condo and a title with no shared claims. For one night, lying awake in that guest room down the hall from where Derek was sleeping, I let myself believe that was the whole shape of it. A desperate, drowning man taking his panic out on the person closest to him. And there was almost a strange relief in that theory because a gambling addiction, however serious, felt like a smaller, more containable monster than the one I'd been quietly afraid actually lived in our condo. Ray didn't share that relief. I found that out the next morning, over coffee, when he told me, in the same flat and certain voice from the diner, that a 6-figure debt to a man like Elias Caldwell explained the pressure. But it didn't explain where Derek thought he was going to find 6 figures to pay it off with. Not on a loan officer's salary, not with a condo that had, according to Derek himself, a clean title and no leverage left to pull. Ray had spent enough years around people who got into holes like that to know the hole always had to get filled from somewhere. And the somewhere was rarely a somewhere that stayed contained to one person's problem. This isn't the whole story, he told me. This is just the part he let slip. There's more underneath it. The next morning, while I sat at the kitchen table with an ice pack pressed to my ribs and Derek still asleep down the hall, Ray made 2 phone calls from the balcony, the same balcony Derek had taken his private calls from all week, which felt like a small, deliberate reclamation even if Ray hadn't meant it that way. The first call was to a woman named Priya Anand, someone Ray had worked alongside for 2 years on a compliance rotation in Lagos before she'd left the rig circuit for a desk job at a regional banking group back in the States. Ray hadn't spoken to her in 3 years, but the kind of trust built while flagging safety violations together on an offshore platform doesn't erode the way ordinary friendships do, and she picked up on the second ring. Ray didn't ask her for anything that first call. He just mentioned, almost in passing, that his niece's husband worked as a loan officer at a regional bank and had apparently run up a significant private debt to an unregulated lender, and asked, as a general question, whether that kind of personal financial pressure ever showed up in a bank's own internal numbers before anyone official noticed. Priya's answer answer, relayed back to me over breakfast, was that it usually did, eventually, but not in the way people expected. Loan officers under acute personal financial pressure rarely embezzled outright in any way that showed up immediately. What showed up first, if anything did, was smaller and stranger. Approval patterns that deviated slightly from underwriting standards, favors done for specific accounts that didn't quite track with ordinary business judgment, a loan officer suddenly becoming unusually attentive to a narrow slice of the client book. She said if Ray had reason to think something was off, the place to look wasn't the big transactions. It was the pattern in the small ones. Ray's second call that morning was to me, in a sense, though I was sitting 3 feet away. He turned around from the balcony railing and asked if I remembered Derek ever mentioning specific clients by name at dinner over the years, the way people sometimes do when work bleeds into home life without anyone noticing. I hadn't thought about it in ages because so much of what Derek said at dinner had become background noise to me by year 3. But once Ray asked, a handful of names surfaced almost on their own. An elderly client Derek called the Whitfield account, mentioned more than once with a strange note of familiarity, as though the relationship had extended past the professional. A woman named Dorothy Kessler he'd once described, laughing as sweet but doesn't understand a word I tell her about her own portfolio. A married couple in their 80s, the Alvarezes, whose name had come up at a dinner once in the context of Derek helping them consolidate some accounts. A phrase that had meant nothing to me at the time, and that now, spoken aloud to Ray in our kitchen, sounded different, heavier, like a stone dropped into water I hadn't realized was that deep. Ray wrote the names down on the back of a diner receipt still in his jacket pocket from 2 days earlier, and didn't say much else about it that morning, but I saw the muscle in his jaw working again, the same valve under pressure look from the kitchen the night of the shove. That was also the morning we finally went to urgent care. Ray drove. He didn't ask permission to drive. He just took the keys off the counter and held the passenger door of my own car open for me, and I let him, grateful in a way I didn't examine too closely for someone else handling the logistics. The clinic was quiet on a weekday morning, and the doctor who saw me, a woman close to my mother's age with steady hands and a manner that asked nothing extra of me, photographed and dated every mark on my body, old and faded alongside the fresh one blooming across my ribs, and typed up a report with the kind of clinical, unemotional precision that I understood watching her work was exactly what would eventually matter most. Ray sat in the waiting room the entire time. He didn't come back to the exam room. He told me afterward in the car that there were things he needed to say out loud to himself in that waiting room that a person shouldn't have to say in front of family, and I didn't ask what those things were. From urgent care, we drove directly to the office of a family law attorney named Rosalind Faber, a name Ray had gotten from Priya that same morning as a professional favor, someone who specialized in exactly this kind of case, and who saw us on short notice because Priya's recommendation apparently carried weight. Rosalind reviewed the urgent care report, took her own notes on everything I told her, and explained in a calm, practical voice that felt almost jarring after 2 years of chaos exactly what an uncontested versus contested divorce would look like given the documentation we now had. She didn't promise anything dramatic. She just laid out a floor under my feet, plank by plank, the same way Ray had been doing for 4 days straight. And by the time we left her office that afternoon, I had, for the first time in longer than I could remember, an actual plan instead of a coffee tin full of $20 bills and a private, exhausted hope. It was on the drive back from Rosalind's office that Priya called Ray again, this time with something more than a general answer. She'd made a few quiet inquiries of her own, nothing official, nothing that would show up on any log yet, just a compliance officer doing what compliance officers do when a trusted friend hands them a name and a hunch. The Whitfield account, Dorothy Kessler, the Alvarezes. 3 names, cross-referenced against nothing more than publicly available property and probate records at first, had turned up something that made Priya's voice, even through the car's speaker, go careful and quiet in a way Ray's had gone the night he found the loan documents in our junk drawer. All 3 were elderly clients of the branch where Derek worked. All 3 had, within the last 18 months, executed changes to beneficiary designations on retirement accounts that Derek had personally processed, and all 3 changes routed eventually through a chain of account restructuring that led, several steps removed and carefully laundered through what looked on paper like ordinary consolidation paperwork, back to an account Derek controlled. I need you to understand what I'm about to say, Ray told me, pulling the car into a gas station lot so he could give the moment his full attention instead of splitting it with traffic. The gambling debt was real, but it's not the reason any of this happened to you. It's not even close to the worst thing he's done. It's just the thing that made him careless enough to leave a paper trail sitting in a kitchen drawer. Priya's quiet inquiries didn't stay quiet for long. Within a week of that conversation in the gas station parking lot, what had started as one compliance officer doing a personal favor for an old friend had become an internal referral that landed on the desk of the bank's regional audit team, and the auditors confirmed within days what Priya had only been able to sketch and outline. Derek had spent close to 2 years systematically redirecting portions of elderly clients' retirement accounts through a layered chain of consolidation paperwork that looked, to anyone not specifically trained to notice, like ordinary portfolio management. Dorothy Kessler, 83 years old and, according to the audit's own language, cognitively vulnerable for prior branch notes Derek had personally filed and then apparently ignored, had lost nearly 40% of her retirement savings to a beneficiary restructuring she had no memory of authorizing. The Alvarezes had lost less proportionally, but had been steered over 18 months into a series of annuity products that generated commissions flowing back toward an account the auditors traced eventually to Derek. The Whitfield account, it turned out, belonged to a 91-year-old widow whose family hadn't checked her statements closely in over a year because Derek had, charmingly, conveniently, offered to handle all the paperwork directly with her so her children wouldn't have to trouble themselves. The auditors used a phrase in their internal summary that Priya read aloud to Ray over the phone, and Ray repeated it to me almost verbatim because he said he wanted me to hear it exactly as written. A pattern of financial exploitation of vulnerable elderly clients, facilitated by a position of institutional trust. It wasn't gambling debt that had made Derek controlling and volatile at home. The gambling debt was downstream of the fraud, not the cause of it. A symptom of a man who had discovered 2 years into a scheme he thought he could manage indefinitely, that stealing from frightened, trusting old people was easier and more lucrative than he'd expected, and who had funneled a portion of what he took into an addiction that eventually spiraled past what even the fraud could cover. The isolation he'd built around me for 2 years hadn't been jealousy or insecurity in the way I'd always assumed. It had been operational security. A wife with an active social life, a wife with friends who asked questions, a wife who wasn't gradually cut off from her own support system, was a wife who might notice something, mention something, ask the wrong question at the wrong dinner party. I had spent 2 years believing I was the target of Derek's cruelty because something was wrong with me, some flaw he'd correctly identified and was trying to correct, when in reality I had simply been in the blast radius of a much larger, much colder operation that had nothing to do with me at all. The auditors moved fast once the internal referral was confirmed, because a bank discovering it has been unknowingly complicit in elder financial abuse moves with a very different urgency than a bank quietly managing a personnel problem. Derek was placed on immediate administrative leave the following morning, escorted out of the branch by 2 people from corporate security while, according to a teller who later gave a statement, he kept insisting there had been some kind of clerical mix-up that would sort itself out by lunch. It did not sort itself out by lunch. Within 72 hours, the bank had filed a formal report with state banking regulators, and within a week, the Alvarez family's own attorney had been in contact with Rosalind, coordinating a parallel civil claim. I was at Rosalind's office, signing the last of my own uncontested divorce paperwork, when Ray got the call confirming the criminal referral had gone through. He stepped into the hallway to take it, and came back in looking like a man who'd just watched a gauge he'd been monitoring for days finally settle into the reading he'd expected all along. "It's done," he said. "Not just yours, all of it." The criminal case moved faster than Rosalind had prepared me to expect, partly because the elder abuse angle gave prosecutors a case that juries respond to with a particular kind of moral clarity, and partly because Dorothy Kessler's daughter, once she understood what had happened to her mother's retirement account, turned out to be a woman with very little patience for procedural delay. Derek led to a reduced set of charges rather than risk trial, a decision his own attorney reportedly pushed hard for once the audit findings became public record. My divorce, filed uncontested with the urgent care report and Rosalind's careful documentation behind it, was finalized in just under 4 months, faster than Rosalind had initially projected, because Derek's attorney made it clear that dragging out a divorce proceeding in parallel with a felony fraud case involving elderly victims was not a fight worth having in front of any judge who'd be reading both files. I moved back in with my parents for a while, into the same bedroom I'd grown up in, sleeping under the same window I used to climb out of as a teenager to sit on the porch roof and look at stars. Ray stayed too, longer than he'd originally planned, sleeping on the pull-out couch in my father's study, cooking eggs every morning with the same unhurried competence he brought to everything else, never once bringing up, in all the weeks that followed, the version of that first morning where he might have gone to our condo and done something with his hands instead of a phone call to an old friend in Lagos. Dorothy Kessler's daughter found me eventually through the civil case, and we met once at a coffee shop neither of us had chosen for any particular reason, except that it was between our 2 houses. She thanked me for something I hadn't done on purpose, for being the loose thread that had unraveled a much larger harm than the one I'd personally lived through, and I didn't know what to say to that because it had never once occurred to me, during any of the 2 years I spent learning the sound of Derek's footsteps in a hallway, that the smallest, most private parts of my own survival were quietly connected to an 83-year-old woman I'd never met. Ray flew north eventually to see the rest of the family the way he'd originally planned before any of this happened, and he called me from the road somewhere outside Roanoke just to check in, the way he used to call from a rig with machinery grinding in the background. I sat on my parents' back porch that evening with the phone against my ear, watching the same stretch of mountain sky I'd grown up under, and found the coffee tin still sitting where I'd left it, $20 bills folded small inside, money I no longer needed to hide from anyone, and I didn't move it. I just let it sit there on the shelf, exactly where it had always been.